1:35 de la tarde. There's a factory on Jefferson Avenue in Detroit that most people walk past without a second glance. Broken windows, crumbling brick, weeds pushing through concrete that hasn't seen a working shift in decades. If you didn't know what you were looking at, you'd assume it was just another casualty of a city that's seen more than its share of industrial collapse. But 70 years ago, this place was building the fastest car on American roads. A car so dominant it won 12 out of 13 NASCAR races in a single season. A car that terrified General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler simultaneously. A car that racing drivers begged to get behind the wheel of, and a car that, despite all of that, couldn't save the company that built it. This is the story of Hudson Motor Car Company. And almost nobody remembers it. To understand how Hudson rose, you have to understand Detroit in the first decade of the 1900s. The automobile industry was not yet an industry, it was a gold rush. Dozens of companies were forming every year, each one convinced it had figured out the formula that would make it rich. Most of them lasted 18 months. A few lasted 5 years. Almost none of them made it to the 1920s. The ones that survived weren't necessarily the ones with the best engineers or the most innovative designs. They were the ones with the right combination of capital, demand, distribution, and sheer stubbornness. Detroit in 1909 was chaotic, loud, and full of possibility in equal measure. Into that environment stepped a man named Joseph L. Hudson. Hudson was not an engineer. He wasn't a mechanic. He had never in his life designed anything with moving parts. What he was one of the most successful retailers in the Midwest. His department store on Woodward Avenue in Detroit was an institution. A place where middle-class families came to buy everything from furniture to clothing to household goods. Hudson understood retail the way a chess grandmaster understands the board. He knew what customers wanted before they knew themselves, and he knew that what they wanted, more than anything else, was value. Not cheap. Value. There is a difference. Cheap means cutting corners. Value means giving people more than they expected for what they paid. When a group of automotive engineers approached him in 1909 looking for backing, Hudson saw the opportunity clearly. He put up the financing, lent his name to the venture, and let the engineers do what engineers do. The Hudson Motor Car Company was incorporated on February 24, 1909. Within its first full year of production, it had sold over 4,000 cars, an extraordinary number for the era. Within a decade it was one of the most recognized names in American motoring. Not because it was the most expensive. Not because it was the most luxurious. Because it was, almost without exception, exactly what it promised to be. Through the 1910s and into the 1920s, Hudson grew steadily and intelligently. The company made a critical decision early on that would define its character for decades: it would compete in the middle of the market. Not the bottom, where Ford's Model T reigned with an iron grip and margins were razor thin. Not the top, where Packard and Pierce Arrow charged prices that put their cars out of reach for most Americans. Hudson aimed squarely at the buyer who had made something of themselves, who wanted a real automobile with real performance and real quality, but who wasn't going to pay Cadillac prices to get it. That buyer existed in enormous numbers, and Hudson served them well. One of the company's smartest moves came in 1919, when it launched a second brand called Essex. Where Hudson sat at the upper end of the middle market, Essex aimed lower, a more affordable car that shared engineering and manufacturing resources with its parent. The strategy worked brilliantly. Essex brought in buyers who couldn't quite stretch to a Hudson, built brand loyalty, and kept the factories running at capacity. By the mid-1920s, the combined Hudson-Essex operation had made Hudson the third largest automaker in the United States, behind only Ford and General Motors. Think about what that means for a moment. In a country that was rapidly becoming the world's leading automobile market, with dozens of manufacturers fighting for market share, Hudson had clawed its way to third place. From a standing start in 1909. The 1920s were good years. Then came 1929, and nothing in America was good anymore. The Great Depression hit the automobile industry with savage force. Companies that had seemed unshakable simply ceased to exist. Marques that had been household names, Peerless, Franklin, Auburn, Cord, vanished one by one as the decade ground on. Hudson survived, but not without pain. ASICS was rebranded as Terraplane in 1932 pulgadas, an attempt to refresh its appeal, and then absorbed back into the Hudson lineup entirely by 1938. The company emerged from the Depression leaner, more cautious, and acutely aware of how quickly the ground could shift beneath it. Then came the war. Between 1942 and 1945, Hudson, like every other American manufacturer, stopped building cars entirely and converted its factories to war production. Hudson built aircraft engines, anti-aircraft guns, naval ordnance, and marine equipment. The company was good at it. Precise manufacturing was precise manufacturing, whether the end product was a family sedan or a gun mount for a destroyer escort. But when the war ended and the factories converted back to civilian production, Hudson faced a decision that would ultimately determine its fate. The decision was this: what kind of car do you build for post-war America? The country coming out of World War II was not the same country that had gone in. Returning veterans had money saved up, optimism in abundance, and an appetite for everything they'd been denied during 4 years of rationing and sacrifice. They wanted houses. They wanted appliances. They wanted cars. And not just any cars, they wanted cars that felt like the future. Big, powerful, chrome-laden machines that announced to the world that America had won and prosperity had arrived. Hudson's answer to this question was, in retrospect, one of the most elegant pieces of automotive engineering of the entire post-war era. In 1948, the company introduced what it called the step-down design. The concept sounds simple when you describe it, but its implications were profound. In a conventional car of the era, the floor of the passenger compartment sat on top of the frame rails, the structural steel members that ran the length of the vehicle. These meant the car sat relatively high off the ground, with a high center of gravity and a boxy, upright profile. Hudson's engineers flipped this relationship. They recessed the floor down between the frame rails, so that passengers were actually sitting inside the frame rather than on top of it. The result was a car that sat dramatically lower than anything else on the road. Lower center of gravity. A wider, more stable stance. A sleek, more modern silhouette. And a passenger compartment that felt genuinely spacious because the floor was so close to the ground. When the 1948 Hudson appeared in showrooms, it looked like nothing else in America. It was wide and low and purposeful, with a fastback roofline that swept cleanly into integrated rear fenders. Other cars of the era looked upright and formal by comparison. The Hudson looked like it was moving even when it was standing still. Customers noticed. Sales were strong. Automotive journalists praised it extravagantly. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed like Hudson had found the formula. Then came the Hornet. In 1951, Hudson introduced the Hornet, and the American automobile world was never quite the same. The Hornet was built on the step-down platform, which meant it had all the handling advantages that low center of gravity provided. But what made it truly special was what sat under the hood. Hudson had developed an inline six-cylinder engine displacing 308 cubic inches, a genuinely large displacement for a six, and fitted it with what the company called twin-H power. A dual carburetor intake system that significantly increased the engine's breathing capacity and output. The result was an engine that produced around 145 horsepower in standard form, which doesn't sound like much by modern standards but was highly competitive for a six-cylinder in 1951. More importantly, the engine had an exceptional power-to-weight relationship at high RPM, and combined with the step-down's low center of gravity, it made the Hornet an extraordinarily capable car on a racing circuit. Stock car racing in America in the early 1950s was a different world from what NASCAR would eventually become. There were no superspeedways yet. The races were run on dirt ovals, converted airfields, and, famously, on the hard-packed sand beach at Daytona. The cars were, in theory, stock, production vehicles that any customer could walk into a dealership and buy. The drivers were tough, resourceful men who had grown up working on machines and understood instinctively how to find speed. And when those drivers got into Hudson Hornets, they found speed in abundance. Marcel Teague was the first to figure it out systematically. Teague was a mechanic and driver from Daytona Beach who had a gift for extracting performance from production engines, and when he built his Hornet to race specification, he found that it was simply faster than everything else on the track through the corners. The step-down's low center of gravity meant the car didn't roll the way its competitors did. It stayed planted. You could carry more speed into a corner than seemed possible, and the car would hold on and come out the other side without drama. On the straights, the twin H-power engine kept pulling right to the top of its rev range. Deage won race after race. Other drivers noticed and started building Hornets. Within 2 seasons, the Hudson Hornet had become so dominant in NASCAR that competitors were petitioning the sanctioning body to handicap it. The numbers from those years are almost surreal. In 1952, Hudson-powered cars won 27 of 34 NASCAR Grand National races. In 1953, they won 22 of 37. Herb Thomas won back-to-back NASCAR championships in 1951 and 1953 pulgadas Hornets. Tim Flock won races in a Hornet. Dick Rathman won races in a Hornet. The Hornet became so synonymous with winning that dealers used race results in their advertising, a practice that now seems obvious but was relatively novel at the time. Walk into a Hudson dealership in 1952, and you were buying the car that was beating everyone on every track in America. For a certain kind of buyer, that meant everything. Hudson leaned into the racing success intelligently. The company developed what it called the Severe Usage Package, a collection of factory-engineered performance parts that dealers could install on customer cars. Stiffer suspension components, higher compression pistons, modified carburation. It was, in effect, a factory performance option available over the counter, years before the muscle car era would make such things commonplace. The Severe Usage Package let Hudson's racing customers build competitive cars while technically maintaining the fiction that these were production vehicles. Everyone understood what was happening, and nobody particularly minded. But here is where the story begins to turn. While Hudson was dominating on the track, the American automobile market was shifting in ways that the company could not fully respond to. General Motors in particular was investing enormous sums in the development of modern overhead valve V8 engines, a fundamentally different architecture from Hudson's side valve 6. The overhead valve V8 was more powerful, more efficient, and more amenable to increases in displacement. When Chevrolet introduced its famous small block V8 in 1955, it produced 162 horsepower in base form, more than Hudson's best 6, and it was lighter, smoother, and more refined. Chrysler had already introduced a powerful Hemi V8 in 1951. Ford had its own overhead valve V8 coming. The message from the market was unmistakable: the future belonged to V8 engines, and Hudson did not have one. This was not for lack of trying. Hudson's engineers had designed a V8 engine that, by all accounts, was technically sound and would have made the Hornet genuinely competitive with anything Detroit was building. The problem was money. To tool up for a completely new engine, to design and build the manufacturing equipment, the casting dies, the machining lines, would have cost somewhere in the range of $25 to $30 million. Hudson simply did not have that money. The company's annual profits, even in its best recent years, had been modest. Its cash reserves were thin. It had been operating for years with the kind of financial margins that left no room for a major capital investment. And so Hudson made the decision that struggling companies so often make when they can't afford the right answer: they found a cheaper answer that they hoped would be good enough. In 1953, the company introduced the Jet.